Mr. President,
Senator from Kentucky.
we are here on the floor of the Senate today to discuss the War Powers Resolution, to discuss the recent war activities in Venezuela. And yet there still is a debate. Some say there's not a war. Some say there is a war. Some say we won't know for a while if there is a war or isn't a war. Last year we had this debate. The junior senator from Texas came forward and he presented a War Powers Resolution for Gaza. He said that President Biden's decision to send U.S. troops in to build a beachhead, to build a pier, was sending them into a war zone. Interestingly, every Republican senator at that time voted for a point of order or against a point of order, and the point of order said no hostilities exist. The point of order at the time said Gaza is not a war. And every Republican voted against that point of order because every Republican considered that Gaza was a war zone and that the War Powers Resolution applied. Fast forward to today, the proposition that the majority of Republicans will put forward is a point of order saying there isn't a war in Venezuela. So they all believed that there was a war in Gaza, but they all now believe that there's not a war in Venezuela. Now, there are arguments, I think, actually for both being war. In Gaza, the troops that were building the beachhead were fired on multiple times. So I would think U.S. troops under fire sounds a bit like you're putting them into a war. Now we have a situation in Venezuela where hundreds of troops were sent in, dozens and dozens of pilots and planes were sent in. You bombed a nation's capital. You had extraordinary rendition of the nation's president. And now we have a blockade involving hundreds of ships and thousands of sailors. But that's not a war. So it's somewhat boggling to the mind that almost every Republican senator believed there was a war when a few soldiers were shot at in Gaza trying to build a pier. I agreed with them. I think that was putting U.S. troops into war. But now every Republican, not every Republican, virtually all the Republican senators who believed that it was a war in Gaza now believe it's not a war in Venezuela. Now, some of them on the quiet will tell you, well, it was a war, but it's all over. It's all done. Yeah, we're not going to quibble. We really weren't arresting somebody. It wasn't a drug arrest. It was a war. It was a mini war, but it's all over. So the War Powers Resolution doesn't apply because the war is over. And yet, we still have an entire military blockade of a country, and that's not a war. This is a real question. So we have been given a legal opinion by the current administration, and we had one of their assistant attorney generals come in and explain to us why this is not a war. And you have to realize this is an important part of the debate because if it is a drug bust, it's not a war. So they've told us this is really just a drug bust. We had to bomb the entire capital. We had to remove all their air defense. We have an armada of 20,000 ships and hundreds of airplanes flown from all over the world, but it really was just a drug arrest. It really isn't a war. But this young man came into us and he explained to us that we probably don't know yet whether it's a war. And the way we will know it's a war is by the scope, the extent, and the duration, including how many people die in the war. So the problem we have, though, is the Constitution gives us the power to initiate war, to declare war. But if we don't know if it's a war until after all the people die, and we add up how many people die, and then they call it a constitutional war because a lot of people died, wouldn't it then be a little bit late to vote on initiating the war? See, this is an enormous debate. This is an important debate, and this should not be sloughed over as, oh, no big deal, the war's already over. Well, we actually don't even know if the war's already over. We are under a blockade. The current administration has said they will send troops back in if they need to. They've said they'll send troops into other countries if they need to. The blockade is said to be, oh, we're going to control the ships and we're going to sell the oil and then we're going to run. We're in charge. It's our oil. We're going to be in charge of Venezuela. But that sounds to me like a military blockade, a long-term military blockade, and I don't know how we argue that that's not war. But the position of the administration, and probably the position of other presidential administrations, because this isn't really and shouldn't be Republican versus Democrat. This should be legislative prerogative versus presidential prerogative, and it should be about the Constitution. The Constitution specifically, thoughtfully, vested the power of initiating war and declaring war to Congress. They talked about it. They talked about it in the Constitutional Convention. They wrote about it in the Federalist Papers. And from Hamilton to Jefferson, the spectrum of our founding fathers concluded they didn't want the president to have this power. They said the initiation, the declaration of war shall be vested by the Constitution in the legislature. So what we have is an elaborate song and dance. They know that declaration of war resides here. They know initiation of war, so they argue first that it's not war, it's a drug bust. But then they say, well, internationally, people say it probably is a war. So in case you think it's a war, we're going to tell you that it's not really a war because we won't know if it's a war till it's over. We don't know, we'll tell you more about, we'll know when the war is over, whether it actually was a war and whether we should have voted to initiate war when the war is over, depending on how many people die. And then they say, well, we're going to look at the scope, extent, and duration of the war, but since we don't know what that is, we're going to guess based on what the policymakers say. And they say that right now they're not going back in, so we don't have to vote on whether or not we're going to war with Venezuela. This to me is an absurdity. It is logic that runs in circles, and it doesn't get us any closer to where we need to be. The reason the Founding Fathers gave this power to the legislature is because they wanted to make war less frequent. They wanted to make war hard to initiate. They wanted to see war more as a defensive notion, not as an offensive enterprise. During the debate over whether Gaza was a war, the resolution was introduced by the junior senator from Texas, and virtually every Republican voted for it. Interestingly, Marco Rubio voted for it. The Secretary of State actually voted to say that the war in Gaza, where troops were being shot at that were building a pier, was a war. But now things seem to have reversed, and all of those who thought Gaza was a war, where there were some shots being fired at the people trying to build a pier, which would, by many people's interpretation, be a lot less than an entire invasion of a capital and the removal of a president and a blockade of an entire country. Every Republican in this body, including the current Secretary of State, voted that Gaza was a war. In making the arguments that Gaza was a war, the junior senator from Texas expressed the reality that the Senate had abdicated its constitutional responsibility. So at that time, the junior senator from Texas argued that Gaza was a war. He said, over recent decades, we have seen the Senate hand away much of our responsibility on foreign policy and national security to the executives. That is contrary to the design of our Constitution, and it is frankly harmful to the Senate and harmful to this country. I couldn't agree more, but I don't understand how it was harmful when we were talking about Gaza, and it's no longer harmful when we're talking about arguably a much greater military incursion into a country. It seems as if, and I know this would be shocking to people, that there's some partisanship here, that there's a different definition of war under Democrats than there is under Republicans. My colleague from Texas went on to highlight the flagrant hypocrisy of both parties, saying on the Senate floor, far too often, the Senate has stepped out of our historic role in foreign policy and said, whatever the president wants, we, the Senate, aren't going to say anything about it. When there is a Republican president, Democrats suddenly discover their voice and say, hey, the Senate ought to say something. But when it's a Democrat president, it seems no matter how incoherent and disastrous the foreign policy from the Democrat president, the Democrat senators don't want the Senate to exercise its authority. I would argue today is evidence that both sides are guilty of this. I would argue that if Gaza was a war, the bombing of the Venezuelan capital and the removal of the president and the blockade of an entire country might qualify as a war. If a few soldiers shooting at our soldiers who are trying to build a temporary pier or a temporary port in Gaza is war, which every Republican in the body voted for, certainly they must think that invasion of a capital is a war, that removing a president is war, or that blockade of a country. So even though the first incursion, the first invasion may well be over, is the blockade of a country not a war? Are we not at war when we have a military blockade of a country? The American people are sick and tired of their elected officials disregarding the Constitution when their party is in power and then becoming ardent defenders of the Constitution when the opposing party is in power. Each of us took an oath to the Constitution to defend it. That applies at all times, not just when it's politically convenient. Congress maintains a constitutional duty to debate matters of war. Playing politics when the lives of our brave service members are on the line and our country is at risk of being entangled in yet another foreign conflict is an inexcusable dereliction of duty. At this point, I think we need to have a fulsome debate, a debate in our country, a debate in the Senate over what war is. But I think anyone who accepts the ludicrous notion that they will tell you what war is after the war is over should not be treated seriously. How can we do our duty? How can we do our duty to initiate and declare war if we don't know what war is until it's over? If after the war we can count the casualties and there were a significant amount of casualties, or the incursion took a significant amount of time, then there is war. Or some will say, well, we can just defund the war. Well, you know what? It's never happened. Find me the senator or congressman who wants to vote against money for our troops who are being shot at. It is very difficult to stop funding a war once we start because a nation's patriotism rises up naturally. The time to start a war is before it gets started. But if they're telling you they define war by how many casualties there are, you got to wait till the war is over to determine whether it was a war, to determine whether we should initiate the war. This is an absurdity. Both parties, really frankly, have been guilty of hypocrisy on this. But the order today that we will be voting on is whether or not the point of order says that this is not a war. Well, invasion of another country, blockading of a country, and removing another country's leader, to my mind, clearly is war, and I will vote against this point of order.